Comenzamos el simposio de la 28ª versión del Festival Internacional de Cine de Valparaíso, dedicado a uno de los maestros de la historia del cine, el cineasta sueco Ingmar Bergman. Y este simposio, que va a estar presente toda la semana en el festival, tiene el honor de abrir con la primera presentación, con la presencia de Jan Holmberg, directamente desde Suecia, que nos va a compartir información sobre el mismo cineasta Ingmar Bergman y la Fundación Bergman. Jan, glad to meet you. Welcome to our festival.
Thank you so very much.
Please, can you talk about yourself, your functions in the foundation?
Right, I am CEO of the Ingmar Bergman Foundation, and the foundation was started in 2002 on the initiative by Ingmar Bergman himself. He had decided at that point of his life, which was only 5 years before he passed, that he wanted to donate his private archive to some institution. He first tried with his alma mater, Stockholm University, but eventually he decided to donate it to the Swedish Film Institute instead. And so the Film Institute, as a kind of a grateful reply to this gift, started the Ingmar Bergman Foundation together with other of Bergman's major collaborators and employers, including, besides the Swedish Film Institute, Svensk Filmindustri, which is a production company that had produced the lion's part of Bergman's films, Sveriges Television, the Swedish broadcasting company, and the Royal Dramatic Theatre, Dramaten, here in Stockholm, the theatre where Bergman worked for some 40 years.
The foundation carries out the task of preserving Bergman's writing work. Is access to the file restricted?
Yes, Bergman himself stated that the archive should be private in the sense that it is not a public archive where everybody would have access. And his reason for this was that the fact that it is a personal archive. So not only does it contain Bergman's own writings, but also some 10,000 letters to and from Bergman, also other written materials by his relatives, friends, even enemies, former lovers, and so on. And as such, Bergman wanted to secure that other parties, other than himself, were to be protected from, say, gossip journalists and the kind. So having said that, we tend to have a very open mind when it comes to researchers. We are very seldomly, we are declining people coming here. It's happened once or twice, I think. And but any one of you who listen to this would be interested in coming to do research in our archives, you would be very welcome to do so.
What's the Bergman's importance for cinema history according to your assessment?
Oh, that's a big question. I think it is safe to say that Ingmar Bergman is instrumental in turning cinema into an art form. Not necessarily because the quality of his work, and certainly there are other filmmakers who would compete for this title, but Bergman was a kind of filmmaker who came to international recognition in the mid-1950s when cinema was just starting to be publicly considered the seventh art form. And as such, Bergman became a prominent name, suffices to give people an impression of a certain kind of cinema. So in that respect, Bergman was, in a way, the paragon of art cinema from the 1950s and onwards, in par with other filmmakers, of course, such as Fellini or Antonioni or Godard and Kurosawa and many others, of course. But I think Bergman was one of very few filmmakers who you didn't have to be a cinephile in the 1960s to recognize the name Ingmar Bergman. And also the fact that cinema was, for instance, became an academic discipline. The one I studied myself, for instance, I have a PhD in film studies. I think Bergman was one of those filmmakers who showed the world in a way that cinema was capable of dealing with the large existential questions. And as such, films could be considered not only art, but also indicative of philosophical, theological, psychological, and other questions. And if I could also expand a little on that question, I think regardless of the quality of his work, Ingmar Bergman was very lucky to come to prominence at a time when cinema as an institution struggled with exactly this. It was actually the same year in 1957 when two of Bergman's most famous films came out, Wild Strawberries and The Seventh Seal. It was the same year when the concept of the auteur was introduced by editors of Cahiers du Cinéma, André Bazin or François Truffaut and others. And so in that respect, the timing was perfect, for Bergman seemed to be one of those filmmakers that the Cahiers du Cinéma group was advocating. Although they initially were more interested in American filmmakers such as Hitchcock and Hawks and Ford and others, Bergman was soon to become the quintessential auteur, a filmmaker who was in complete control over his work, much as the writer of his work. So in that sense, Bergman became rather quickly the epitome of filmmaker as artist.
I must be sincere with you. I feel in these moments a little sad. I look back 60, 65 years ago, and I found Bergman, Antonioni, Fellini, Godard, Truffaut, Ford, Wilder, Wells, Hitchcock. Everybody's making a film or preparing a film in 1 year, 60, 61, 62. That was the time for genius. What do you think about the genius now? We need genius in the cinema now. There are genius in cinema now.
Well, I certainly share your sense of loss here. Uh, I I agree with you that I'm not consciously trying to be nostalgic here, but I think it is safe to say that cinema had its golden age around the decade of the 1960s, and Bergman, of course, was a part of it, as were the other filmmakers that you mentioned, and many others, of course. And I think, although in the larger scheme of things, it's of course hard to assess what period was most interesting in, say, the history of literature or art or music. But cinema, by comparison, has a very short history, a little over 100 years. I think it's easier in a way to see the development, and I think that the 1960s was the peak of cinema much due to the competition of television, for instance. Suddenly, film had to struggle in a way to find unique selling point, if you like, and did so in many different ways. But one of them was to turn cinema into an art form, and I think although I'm sure there are geniuses working in cinema today, it does not really compare, does it? And of course, the whole infrastructure of the industry and of the art form has changed so rapidly, and there are so many other competing forms of entertainment and art. The circumstances are so much different, and the prerequisites for the filmmakers are so different than they were in the 1960s. So it's much harder to reach out to an audience than it was in the 60s. So it's not just because people were, more brilliant in the 1960s, but that the industry has changed so much that we possibly today see more geniuses in the video game industry than we do in the film industry, perhaps.
What could you say about Bergman's creative process?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the beauty of the Ingmar Bergman archives. They really offer a unique insight into his creative process, because Bergman would save all of his writings, starting with the very first draft to what is to become a film, and then over to the handwritten script, and then to typewritten version, and the second with all the corrections, which eventually makes it to the shooting script. So we can see, for instance, how a certain film is developed from the very first idea that comes to Bergman's mind and into the finished film. Yes, so for instance, this is what Bergman referred to as one of his workbooks, which is essentially a diary or a journal containing his first drafts to a specific film, in this case, Persona. And in this, we can see, for instance, how he dates it so much as he would a diary. So here, the 15th of April, Bergman writes, "Physiognomical studies. Mrs. Vogler has an expression of sternness, but also of a soft childishness." And so this is just a draft or an idea that he has, but anyone who has seen Persona can confirm that this is actually the case with Liv Ullmann's character in the film. So starting with this workbook, then at some point, Bergman starts writing the actual script, which he always did by hand on a specific kind of paper that he would use already in the early 1940s and throughout his whole career. So because Bergman was a very neurotic person, so he always demanded the same kind of writing tools. And then eventually, from the workbook and then to the handwritten script and to the typewritten versions and so on, evolves the shooting script, which in this case looks like this. So here we can see, for instance, how it's much like any screenplay would look like. And again, we can see how certain omissions or changes are made, possibly in collaboration with the actors. For instance, like here, there is a line saying, "Now it's night," and and he changes it a bit to a similar but still other lines like oh, to think of it as being night right now or so. So like I said, the uh, in the archive it is possible to follow the entire process where all the changes are made, and then of course to compare it with the final product, which is a film, of course.
What did his closest collaborators say about work with him?
I think they all agreed that he was capable of making the set, a movie set, a kind of a secure place where he would exclude all disturbing elements from the outside, and making the actors, the cinematographer, and the set designers, electricians, and so on, being part of a collective process where they could work undisturbed. On the one hand. On the other, Bergman was famous for his outbursts, for instance. He would at times be rather difficult, and he could lash out at people who he felt were underperforming, for instance. So he was not an easy person to work with in a sense, but certainly he was not the kind of dictatorial director that some others have been labeled as. Bergman was seemingly very open to others' ideas and input, but it was no question who decided at the final, in the end. So there was it was a mix, I would say. There are many actors, for instance, who have said almost at the same time that Bergman was the most fantastic person they had ever worked with, but also the most horrible. So I think that sums it up.
As a man, an artist, what were his convictions? I mean, his philosophical and religious convictions.
As most people who are lucky enough to become old, and Bergman was 86 when he died, he would change throughout his life. And uh, the Bergman we would talk about in the 1940s, and the one in the mid 1960s, and the one uh, in the 1990s were three very different persons. I would say that Bergman is rather famous for his dealings with God, for instance, or the silence of God. And God is always a rather distant, even absent force in Bergman's films, but he still seems to have an impact on the people in the films. But in one of the films that most famously depicts this is, of course, The Seventh Seal, at which point Bergman would say that he was a non-believer, that he had lost his religion, which he was brought up with. His father was a pastor, but claimed to have discovered that there is no God. On the other hand, in his later films, there is a much more affirmative approach to religion, or to the existence of God. And I think that all in all, whether he said that he believed or not, Bergman was a very religious filmmaker. Religion and Christianity was a major, not only influence, but also a major theme in his films throughout his career. And regarding Bergman's more overall philosophical ideas of life, not only the religious ones, I think that if we were to decide on one specific major theme in Bergman's films, it would be the problems of communication, the lack of communication. And as such, the one-way communication between man and God is more or less a metaphor for the lack of communication between human beings. So when, for instance, the Knight of the Seventh Seal tries to pray to God and doesn't get any answer, it is not unlike, for instance, the quarreling couple in Scenes from a Marriage who try to reach to each other, try to communicate, try to understand one another without succeeding. So in that sense, Bergman seems to have a rather bleak idea of man's capacity of reaching his fellow human beings. On the other hand, I think ultimately Bergman is much more optimistic than he often gets credit for, because in almost all of his films, there are at least certain points where characters actually reach some kind of understanding, some kind of union, and experience a kind of harmony. Not necessarily at the end of the film, but there are still points in almost all of his films where this harmony can be reached, at least.
And finally, in the context of Swedish cinema, how is his work currently received?
Um, I think there has been a change because Sweden is such a small country, and Bergman is such an internationally renowned person. So there certainly was a time, and a rather long time of Bergman's career, where other Swedish filmmakers felt that his star would shine so brightly that there was not any light left for the others. And so, in that respect, Bergman was rather critically received in Sweden for many years. I think now, though, almost 20 years after he died, there is a new interest in Bergman in his home country, because younger filmmakers have no, direct relationship to Bergman. They have not suffered from his, vast influence, and they can look at his films without prejudice and rather as the films are, rather than films by this specific filmmaker who was such a prominent figure in Swedish cultural life. So I would say that filmmakers in Sweden today, if indeed they have a relationship to Ingmar Bergman, they seem to be more interested in him. And having said that, I think that that it can have its drawbacks. For instance, when Ruben Östlund receives the Golden Palm at the Cannes Film Festival, that the international press talks about Östlund as being from the country of Ingmar Bergman rather than recognized in his own right. So still, Bergman is perceived internationally, at least, as being the Swedish filmmaker. But in a way, I think other filmmakers from Sweden have benefited from this as well, because Sweden is already recognized as a major nation of cinema then.
Would you like to say something about Stiller or Sjöström?
Yes, well, of course, Stiller and even more so Victor Sjöström were both major influences on Ingmar Bergman, and were in the 19 teens and 20s recognized all over the world. And so in that sense, Swedish cinema has been rather prominent in world cinema, and something to be proud of as a Swede, I would say. So yes, Bergman did not come from a vacuum. He was very much a part of a tradition of Swedish cinema that was started already in the early 19 teens.
Well, dear Jan, I want to thank you a lot for your time, your knowledge, your wisdom that you shared with us in our festival. And we will continue development and other subjects during this week. But this meeting with you is essential to know about Bergman. Many thanks.
Please, the gratitude is all mine. I thank you so much, Jaime, and Margit, for your patience. And thank you for screening Ingmar Bergman's films to an audience that haven't necessarily seen them before. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for his work to be continually enjoyed. And thank you for great questions. It was my pleasure to try to answer them as best as I could. So thank you so much.
Bueno, y tras esta maravillosa entrevista, deseamos agradecer a Margit Schmoll, nuestra traductora histórica del Festival de Cine primero de Valparaíso y ahora Festival de Cine Recobrado, por su maravillosa intervención ayudándonos a contactarnos, conectarnos y comprender de manera más profunda las respuestas de Jan Holmberg. Margit.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. Para mí siempre es un gran placer y un honor. Aprendo montones también con esto. Así que muchas gracias. Y mucho éxito en el simposio.
Gracias, Margit. Bueno, concluimos así nuestro primer acercamiento hacia el mundo de Ingmar Bergman con esta charla directamente con la fuente sueca, ¿no?, de información, que es Jan Holmberg. Y durante la semana vamos a tener otras ponencias donde se va a tomar desde la simbología en la flauta mágica, las artes performativas en el teatro y la ópera, la filosofía existencialista, es decir, tratar de abarcar lo más que podamos de este mundo profundo, complejo y a veces también ominoso de la filmografía de Ingmar Bergman. Así que nos seguimos encontrando toda la semana.